Jane Pierce knew, before the train left Boston, that something was wrong. She had prayed for this presidency not to happen. She had fainted at the news of her husband's nomination. When Franklin took their son to the shore to celebrate the election win, 11-year-old Benny wrote home to his mother in plain language, "I hope he won't be elected, for I should not like to be at Washington, and I know you would not either." The boy was right. Jane Pierce spent 20 years trying to keep her husband out of politics. She had come close twice. And then the Democratic Party made Franklin Pierce their candidate anyway, and she discovered, afterward, that he had allowed it. Quietly. Without telling her. 6 weeks before the inauguration. January 6, 1853. The coupling on their train car failed. The car rolled. Jane Pierce walked away with bruises. Benny did not walk away. His skull was crushed in the wreckage. He died instantly, the only fatality, in front of both his parents. What no one told Jane Pierce was this: there was a rule for what came next. A system for how a president's wife was expected to grieve. How long it was permitted to last. How quietly it was supposed to be worn. She had never been told. She was about to find out what happened to women who didn't follow the rules they were never given. What she had to be to get in. Jane Means Appleton was born in 1806 in Hampton, New Hampshire, the daughter of Reverend Jesse Appleton, a Congregationalist minister who would become president of Bowdoin College. She grew up inside two systems simultaneously, the church and the New England elite. Both had the same lesson at their center. A woman of her class was expected to be refined, devout, delicate, and quietly decorative. These were not insults. In 1820, in New England, among people like the Appletons, these were prerequisites. She was educated at Miss Catherine Fisk's Young Ladies' Seminary in Keene, New Hampshire, a prestigious institution, better than most women of her era could access. She was talented in music, enthusiastic about literature. She also chose Bible study over both. She was physically fragile, prone to severe winter illness, constitutionally shy. She was, in other words, exactly what the system had ordered. Her father's Calvinist theology shaped her more than any school. What Calvinist theology offered women, specifically, was this: suffering is never random. God has a plan. The tragedies that befall you are not accidents, they are tests, or corrections, or the workings of a divine will that operates beyond human comprehension. You are not supposed to fight the plan. You are supposed to submit to it and find in submission both virtue and peace. Jane Pierce would carry this theology her entire life. It would eventually become the thing that let her survive, and the thing that broke her. But that comes later. What mattered at the entry point was that the system had done its primary work before Franklin Pierce ever arrived. It had told her that her proper sphere was domestic, that her intelligence was for private use, never public assertion, that the correct response to pain was endurance, not resistance. The church built that framework. Her family reinforced it. Miss Fisk's seminary polished it into something that looked like refinement. Franklin Pierce arrived as a young law student, charming, gregarious, already calculating his way toward office. He had attended Bowdoin where her father presided. He drank. She was a committed temperance advocate active in New England reform movements. He wanted Washington. She already understood that Washington was a place where women got sick and husbands got ruined. Her family objected to him on every ground available: his politics, his drinking, his ambitions, his class associations. Jane Pierce spent 8 years refusing him. She did not marry Franklin Pierce until she was 28, remarkable in an era when women married before 25 or not at all. What kept her resistant for that long is not fully recoverable from the record. What we know is that eventually, as systems do, it closed around her. She married Franklin Pierce on November 19, 1834. They left for Washington 30 minutes after the ceremony, dressed in her traveling clothes and bonnet, the same outfit she had been wed in, because there was no time or inclination to change. Washington was where he needed to be. The wedding was a formality on the way there. The entry fee had always been steep. She had simply never been shown the invoice. What the entry required, in the end, was not just the willingness to marry him. It was the willingness to accept that his world was now the whole world. That his ambitions set the geography of her life. That her intelligence, her values, her physical limits, her religious convictions, all of these were factors she was permitted to hold privately, but none of them constituted a veto. She had spent 8 years believing that resistance was an option. November 19, 1834 was the day the system informed her otherwise. What she was expected to never say. She said it anyway. And the record of what happened each time tells you exactly how the rule worked. She said she hated Washington. She said it plainly from the first year of their marriage. In 1835, her health deteriorated sharply in the capital, the damp winters, the social obligations, the constant political performance she was expected to participate in without participating, and she left. She went back to New Hampshire to recover with her mother while Franklin remained in Congress. This became the template. She would tell him the city was making her sick. She would tell him the political life was not for her. She would go home. He would stay. What the rule permitted, a wife could be ill. What it did not permit, a wife could be opposed. The illness did the work the objection could not. She said she wanted him to leave politics entirely. In 1842, she succeeded. Franklin Pierce resigned from the United States Senate, one of the most powerful positions in the country, and came home to Concord. Their first son had died 3 days after birth in 1836. Their second son had arrived in 1839. Jane's explicit, sustained lobbying for a quieter life was central to Franklin's decision, even if it was not the version history recorded. When President Polk offered Pierce the Attorney Generalship shortly afterward, Franklin declined in writing, citing his wife's health. His exact language, besides you know that Mrs. Pierce's health while at Washington was very delicate. Her health, not her objections. Not her moral opposition to the political life. Not the fact that she had watched her first child die while her husband was 300 miles away in the capital and she was alone. Illness was acceptable. Dissent was not. She was permitted to be fragile. She was not permitted to be correct. She said she didn't want him to run for president. She said it in every register available. She fainted at the news of his nomination. She prayed publicly for his defeat. She let their son write home with his own version of the same wish. And then she discovered the thing that collapsed whatever remained between them. Franklin Pierce had not been an unwilling nominee. He had gone to the Democratic Convention in Baltimore in June of 1852 and allowed friends to place his name forward as the compromise candidate. Knowing his wife's position, knowing his son's position, knowing he had told Jane he was out. He had not been out. He had simply stopped telling her what he was doing. The convention was deadlocked between 4 candidates. Pierce's name was entered on the 35th ballot. He won the nomination on the 49th. And somewhere in those 14 ballots, with his wife at home believing the matter was settled, the decision that would define the rest of her life was made without her knowledge. She found out. The timeline of exactly when is not precisely documented, but the historical record is clear that by the time she arrived at the White House, she knew. She knew Franklin had sought this. She knew the story of the reluctant candidate had been a management strategy, not a truth. And she had no recourse. The rule of silence meant there was no public forum available to her. The rule of loyalty meant there was no private forum she was permitted to take public. The rules worked together, interlocking, so that what should have been a conversation, a reckoning, an accounting, had nowhere to occur except in her own room, alone, without an audience, without a record, without any consequence for the person who had engineered the situation. The rule of silence ran in both directions. It was only enforced in one. When Jane Pierce arrived at the White House in March 1853, shattered by grief and by the discovery of what her husband had done, she said nothing publicly. The rule did not permit a First Lady to announce that her husband had deceived her. She arranged mourning bunting in the state rooms. She went upstairs. The system received her silence as obedience. It was not obedience. It was the sound of a woman who had finally run out of ways to be heard, who she was required to protect. The institution that needed protecting in 1853 was the Pierce presidency, and the machinery of that protection operated through multiple actors, without any of them needing to name what they were doing. Consider Nathaniel Hawthorne. In 1852, Hawthorne, Franklin's closest friend from Bowdoin, one of the most acclaimed writers in America, published the official campaign biography of Franklin Pierce. In it, he described Jane's fragile health as the reason Franklin had declined the Polk cabinet offer years earlier. He created, in print, a permanent character. Jane Pierce was a delicate woman whose physical limitations had gently restrained a husband who might otherwise have served even more ambitiously. What the biography did not say, that Jane had politically lobbied against those ambitions, that her objections were moral and ideological, not merely physical, that she had views directly in conflict with the positions her husband had built his career on. The biography circulated. The portrait it created became the permanent record. Hawthorne was not being cruel. He was serving a function. The function of the campaign biography was to produce an acceptable wife, and he produced one. Jane's health could be acknowledged. Her dissent could not. He wrote the version that served the candidacy, and the version that served the candidacy is the one that survived. She could not correct it. There was no mechanism by which a candidate's wife in 1852 could say, publicly, in a forum that anyone in power was required to hear, "I am not merely ill. I am opposed." The distinction did not have available language. The rule of loyalty extended further. Jane Pierce was deeply anti-slavery. She came from abolition-sympathizing New England. Her private correspondence, recovered later, shows a woman who understood the moral weight of the slavery question and found her husband's positions on it morally troubling. In 1856, she successfully lobbied Franklin to pardon Dr. John Robinson, a relative imprisoned by pro-slavery forces in Kansas for distributing anti-slavery materials, and secured his release. She privately opposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which Franklin signed in May of 1854, which struck down the Missouri Compromise, opened the Western territories to slavery's expansion, and unleashed the violence that historians now call the beginning of the road to civil war. The Kansas-Nebraska Act destroyed Franklin Pierce's presidency. Northern Democrats who had elected him turned against him. The party refused to renominate him in 1856. What replaced the act was Bleeding Kansas, 2 years of guerrilla warfare between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers, the caning of Senator Charles Sumner on the Senate floor, the rise of Abraham Lincoln, and the formation of the Republican Party. The machinery of civil war was assembled on Pierce's watch, piece by piece, and the act he signed was the central mechanism. The woman upstairs knew it was wrong before he signed it. She said so in private. She had no instrument that could reach any forum where it mattered. She did not say any of this in public. She did not appear at any public event for the first 2 years of the presidency. She did not speak to the press. She did not attach her name to any position. When the administration needed a visible social presence, and it always does, that role was assumed by Varina Howell Davis, wife of Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, who effectively became Washington's hostess for the Pierce years. Jane Pierce was grateful for this arrangement. The rule of loyalty required her to protect a presidency whose moral direction contradicted everything she believed. She protected it in the most thorough way available. She made herself absent. History called it grief. It was also the only form of resistance she was permitted. What she had to look like. Victorian mourning was not a private condition. It was a time codified public performance, and in 1853, every woman in Jane Pierce's social world knew the schedule precisely. Deep mourning, approximately 1 year. Heavy black wool, no ornamentation, full black veil in public. No social events beyond those strictly required for the family's functioning. After deep mourning, 9 months of half mourning, a slight relaxation of dress, gray permitted at the edges. After that, 3 to 6 months of transition. Then the return to ordinary life. The rule said, 1 year in black. Then you come back. Jane Pierce stayed in black for 2 full years. This was the specific violation, not the grief. Grief was permitted, even expected, even respected. What Washington could not accommodate was grief that refused to conclude on schedule. Grief that kept the White House staterooms hung in mourning bunting past the allotted term. Grief that required a First Lady's social duties to be permanently delegated to another woman. The rule of appearance did not demand that a mother stop missing her dead child. It demanded that she stop showing it at the appointed time for the convenience of the administration she had never wanted to be part of. Nathaniel Hawthorne, who knew her and wrote about her privately with a mixture of pity and discomfort, called her a death's head. The official title Washington gave her was kinder only in phrasing, the shadow in the White House. She was present, technically. She was upstairs. She just refused to appear. What she was doing upstairs, she was writing letters to Benny. One of those letters has survived. She wrote, "My precious child, I must write to you, although you are never to see it or know it. How I long to see you." She wrote about the Sunday evenings when he would lean against her on the sofa, about the Sabbath kisses before bed, about sitting close beside him, his hand in hers, in the stillness of the only hours she had ever truly wanted, about how she had not valued any of it as she ought, and how she could not stop returning to that failure, sitting alone in the house that was supposed to be hers, in the city she had never wanted to live in, performing the grief she was already performing too visibly for a nation that was watching her grief and finding it inconvenient. The performance the system required was the performance of a woman managing. She was not managing. The performance of managing is always the rule, and the rule had nothing to offer her in exchange for performing it. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you know that Jane Pierce is not an exception. She's a pattern. The stories we tell here are the ones history recorded as personal failure and privately knew were something else entirely. If you aren't subscribed, this would be the moment. These women deserve witnesses. What she was allowed to have. Jane Appleton came from a family with resources. Her mother's family, the Means, were prosperous New England landowners. She had grown up in the Bowdoin College president's residence, then in her maternal grandparents' mansion in Amherst. She was not a woman without background. That background ended at the altar. The law of coverture, which governed every American woman's financial life when Jane Pierce married in 1834, operated on a single principle: a wife had no separate legal existence. Her property became her husband's property at marriage. Her potential earnings became his. Her ability to enter contracts, hold assets, sue or be sued, all of it transferred to him at the ceremony. This was not a New Hampshire peculiarity. It was the foundational legal architecture of marriage across the United States. The Married Women's Property Act, which began dismantling coverture, passed in New York in 1848, 14 years after Jane's wedding. New Hampshire's equivalent came later still. Nothing that arrived after 1834 affected what Jane Pierce had already signed away. She had no money of her own. She would never have money of her own. What this meant practically, every time Jane Pierce left Washington, it was because her husband allowed it. Every time she came back, it was because he required it. When she did not attend the inauguration in March of 1853, it was not an assertion of independence. She had no mechanism for independence. It was the behavior of a woman so thoroughly destroyed that the machinery of compliance temporarily stopped operating. She couldn't leave. She could only fail to perform. The legal architecture of her marriage and the social architecture of the First Ladyship were the same structure. Both said, "You are here because of him. You function because of him. You have access to this house, this position, this identity, through him, and only through him." The cage and the altar were built from identical materials. The particular irony at the center of the money rule, the White House itself. It was her residence. She had not chosen it. She could not vacate it without her husband's cooperation. The one mark she made on the building, the only redecoration she undertook, was the mourning bunting she ordered hung in the staterooms. The rooms wore what she wore, unrelieved black. Even the grief was dressed in the only color she could still control, what she owed her children. Jane Pierce had 3 sons, and the record of their deaths is the record of her life. Franklin Jr., born in 1836, died 3 days later. Frank Robert, born 1839, died of typhus in 1843 at the age of 4. Benjamin, Benny, born 1841, died at 11 in January of 1853 in a Massachusetts train wreck. The rule of motherhood in the Victorian era contained 2 instructions that could not be followed simultaneously. The first, your children are the primary evidence of your worth as a woman. The second, if they die, you must bear it. Grief is natural. Extended, public, disruptive grief. Grief that refuses the schedule, grief that bleeds into functions and obligations, is not love. It is weakness. Jane Pierce violated the second instruction so completely that the first became irrelevant. She did not attend Benny's funeral. She could not attend the inauguration. She arrived at the White House weeks after her husband had been sworn in and went directly to her room, where she wrote those letters. Not letters to friends or family, but to Benny himself. In them she asked his forgiveness, specific, searching, unanswerable forgiveness for the moments she felt she had failed him while he was alive. The guilt driving those letters is worth naming precisely because it was not abstract. The private record suggests Jane Pierce believed she had withheld something from Benny, not intentionally, but out of the unconscious self-protection of a woman who had already buried 2 children. She had perhaps held back some portion of love as a kind of insurance against a third unbearable loss. Then the third loss arrived anyway, and the insurance was revealed as nothing but absence. She could not stop returning to the question of whether the distance had cost her moments she could never recover. The rule of motherhood offered her no exit from that loop. The same cultural system that told her grief was weakness had also told her that insufficient visible love was failure. There was no correct position. She had either loved too much, too demonstrably, too disruptively, or not enough, too carefully, with too much held back. The system had arranged the evidence so that any feeling she had, expressed in any register, pointed back to her as the source of the problem. She sought mediums. This is documented, if imprecisely. The Miller Center records her as participating in seances in order to contact Benny. The specific practitioners and the nature of those sessions are not cleanly verifiable. What is verifiable? Spiritualism was not fringe in 1853. It was a rapidly growing movement across America and Britain, offering bereaved families something institutional religion could not. The possibility that death was not a final severance. That a mother's obligation to her child did not end with burial. Here is where the Calvinist theology she had been raised in became specifically devastating. Her faith told her, God's plan is sovereign. What happens is what God permits. If your children die, there is a reason. If your husband reaches the presidency over your sustained objections, there is a reason. The loss of 3 sons was not a catastrophe. It was a message. The message Jane Pierce received, and wrote into letters, and carried for the rest of her life, was that God had taken Benny so that Franklin could govern without distraction. That her son's death was the price the presidency required. This was not comfort. It was the logic of submission applied to her greatest loss. Her theology, which had been built to help her endure, had turned her grief into a justification for the thing that caused it. She could not grieve Benny as a cost of her husband's ambition without that grief becoming an accusation. She could not grieve him as God's design without that design becoming her acceptance. The grief had no direction that didn't double back into submission. She needed to reach him. She went looking in the only places left. What happened to women who tried to leave? Jane Pierce did not divorce Franklin. Divorce existed in New Hampshire in the 1850s. The state had comparatively accessible statutes for the era, but divorce meant public exposure, financial abandonment, social death, and the loss of the only identity the system had ever allowed her to inhabit. A divorced woman in 1853 was not simply unmarried. She was erased. What she executed instead was a partial withdrawal. She refused to perform the role. She stayed in her room. She delegated her official duties to Varina Howell Davis and Abby Kent Means. She maintained the form of the marriage while declining its most visible requirements. She was present in the building. She was absent from everything the building represented. The system's response was not legal. It didn't need to be. The available tools were reputation and record, and they worked perfectly. She became the shadow in the White House. She was described in contemporary accounts as an invalid, a depressive, a liability to an already struggling administration. Nathaniel Hawthorne, who had written her husband's favorable campaign biography and privately called her a death's head, watched the same woman he had helped package for public consumption become the symbol of the presidency's failure. The cruelty of the historical verdict on Jane Pierce is precise. It used her grief as evidence of her inadequacy. She was called a hypochondriac, a woman who failed to support her husband in his hour of need, a damaging presence in a presidency that could not afford damage. What those verdicts do not ask, what it would have looked like to support a husband who had deceived her about seeking the nomination, whose administration was built on policies she found morally indefensible, and who processed his own grief through increasing alcohol consumption, a problem the public was aware of, a problem that appeared in political cartoons during the 1852 campaign, a problem that worsened throughout the presidency and consumed him after Jane died. They do not ask what support was supposed to look like from a woman who had watched her last surviving child's skull shatter in a train wreck and was then expected, 6 weeks later, to stand at an inaugural podium and smile. She didn't smile. Not then. Not in the White House portraits. Not in the years after. The shadow in the White House. As though the shadow were her character flaw rather than a function of being kept permanently in the dark. After the presidency ended in March of 1857, the Pierces traveled, the Caribbean first, then Portugal, then Europe, years of wandering through Madeira and Rome and the Bahamas. Franklin visited Nathaniel Hawthorne in Rome. Observers noted he was in good spirits. The travel was Franklin's idea, Franklin's coping. He wrote letters about American politics from abroad. He continued to insist that Northern abolitionists were to blame for sectional conflict. He remained, in exile, who he had always been. Jane longed for New Hampshire, for Concord, for the graves of her sons. She carried Benny's Bible through all of it. She came home eventually. She spent her final years with her sister Mary Aiken in Andover, Massachusetts, the same town where she had gone as a young woman, the same New England world she had always belonged to and never been allowed to remain in. She died on December 2, 1863, of tuberculosis. She was 57 years old. She had lived the entire Civil War, the war that Franklin's presidency had helped make inevitable, the war that vindicated every moral instinct she had held and been required to keep silent. She was buried in Old North Cemetery in Concord, as she had wanted, next to the boys. The one rule she couldn't follow. It wasn't the rule of silence. She had found ways around it. Private letters, careful domestic pressure, small interventions that occasionally shaped outcomes at the edges of the policy she was never supposed to touch. It wasn't the rule of appearance. She had violated it openly and absorbed the reputational cost. She had survived. It wasn't the rule of loyalty to a husband whose moral and political choices directly contradicted her own. She had maintained the form. She had stayed. She had not spoken against him publicly. The rule that broke Jane Pierce was more fundamental than any of those. It was the rule that said the life of the public man takes precedence. Always. Over the private family. Over the wife's health. Over the wife's moral convictions. Over the children's wishes, and Benny had written his wishes down in clear language at 11 years old and sent them home from school, and they had not been sufficient to stop anything. Over the wife's grief. Once the cost of the public life had been extracted and the bill had been presented and there was nothing left to pay it with. This rule operated at every stage of their marriage. It operated in 1834 when she followed him to Washington and got sick. It operated in 1842 when she persuaded him home and they had 4 years of quiet. The 4 years every account of the Pierce marriage describes as the only happy ones, before he went back without telling her. It operated on January 6, 1853, on a train in Massachusetts, when a family was in transit to prepare for a presidency the wife had spent 2 decades trying to prevent. The rule said, "His life comes first. Your health is a footnote. Your convictions are private correspondence. Your grief has a calendar, and when the calendar expires, you appear." And then the rule demanded one thing more, the thing that made the whole structure impossible. When the cost of his public life was paid in the currency of her child's death, she was required to find a framework that made the cost acceptable. She was required to believe that Benny's death was not a consequence of her husband's ambition. It was God's will. God had taken her son so that the president could govern without distraction. She believed it. She wrote it in letters. She spent the rest of her life unable to resolve whether believing it had saved her or destroyed her, because what the belief required, at its foundation, was the acceptance that her son's death was the appropriate price of a presidency she had spent 20 years trying to prevent. The belief gave her a framework. It also sealed every exit. She could not grieve Benny as a consequence of her husband's ambition without that grief becoming an accusation she couldn't speak. She could not grieve him as God's design without that design becoming her permanent sentence. The theology turned the loss into a verdict, and the verdict was, this was necessary. You are supposed to be at peace with it. This was not comfort. This was the rule of the public man's supremacy so completely internalized that it had colonized her theology. She had made the sacrifice sacred because the only alternative, understanding it as unnecessary, was more than she could survive. The rule that broke Jane Pierce was not one rule. It was the entire system, which demanded she find a way to make her own destruction mean something. I want to say this directly. What history has done with Jane Pierce is exactly what the system she lived inside was designed to do. It named her a failure, a bad first lady, a woman who could not rise to the occasion, a shadow. It never named the occasion. It never described what rising would have required. It never acknowledged that she watched her last child die in a train wreck 6 weeks before an inauguration she had prayed would be cancelled, and that what was asked of her, to perform public dignity, on schedule, on her husband's timeline, was not a reasonable thing to ask of a human being. She didn't perform it. She went upstairs. She wrote letters to a boy who would never read them. She looked for him in the only places the official world hadn't closed off. History called that a failure. I think it was the most honest thing she had left. She was buried next to Benny, next to Frank Robert, next to the infant who died before he was named. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, the legislation that Franklin Pierce signed in May of 1854, that opened the Western territories to slavery's potential expansion, that lit the fuse of bleeding Kansas and accelerated the fracture of a nation already splitting, that act, and its consequences, Jane Pierce privately opposed. She said so in letters. She said so in the quiet of a marriage whose public face she was required to protect. The system did not ask for more than that. The Civil War began in April 1861. Jane Pierce died in December 1863, 2.5 years into it. The machinery that had produced that war was built in part by a man whose wife had understood the stakes better than he had, and had no instrument available to make anyone in power listen. She carried Benny's Bible to the end. She was buried next to his grave. The rules she had navigated, entry, silence, loyalty, appearance, money, motherhood, exit, they did not stop when she did. They moved, as systems do, into the next marriage, into the next woman standing at the threshold of a life she didn't choose, being informed, without being told, what the rules were. Some of you know exactly what that means. Some of you lived a version of it. Some of you are only now, in whatever quiet you found, beginning to name what the rules were that governed your life. That is what Jane Pierce deserved. The naming. She never received it while she was alive. This is a start.